falling to 4.7%, down just a smidgen on where it was. Rishi Sunak says the data is promising. Gary Stevenson is a former City trader turned economist and financial campaigner. Gary, thank you very much for your time this morning. So massive numbers of job vacancies, unemployment down a little. Rishi Sunak says it's encouraging or promising. Do you think he's right to come to that conclusion?
Well, I mean, there's definitely some good news here. If you look at it on face value, vacancies are up. So that should mean if you're looking for a job, it should be easy to get one. Unemployment rate is coming down. But, obviously, these are not normal times, and COVID has massively affected all the statistics massively, right? So we've got a very high number of vacancies, right? But these numbers are for the second quarter of the year. And
so that's April, May, June of this year.
Yeah, and in that period, basically every single restaurant, pub, bar in the country was reopening, for the first time in, pretty much a year. So a lot of these guys need new staff. So it's not really any surprise that at that period, there was a high level of vacancies. There were a lot of other things affecting vacancies as well. Brexit and COVID meant there's fewer foreign workers. So yeah, more vacancies than usual. That is good news if you're looking for a job, but I think we should be careful reading too much into these numbers. There are a lot of other things happening in the economy which could be cause for concern.
Well, let's pick up on Brexit, because it's striking, isn't it? Every country in Europe has had COVID, only Britain has empty supermarket shelves. It is plainly the case that COVID has caused difficulties for all countries, but in this country we've had the additional unnecessary self-inflicted damage from Brexit.
Yeah, well, obviously what we've had is Brexit happening at the same time as COVID, right? So there's this tricky situation where it can be quite difficult for economists to work out exactly what is being caused by COVID and what is being caused by Brexit. But, if you look at some of the areas where there are problems, a lot of them are areas where traditionally a lot of workers might have been coming from overseas, from the EU. So that's definitely contributing to some of the reasons why some industries are struggling to find workers.
Yes. And of course, the government had the option, didn't it, last year, of extending the transition period, so we wouldn't have to be fighting these two things at the same time, but it chose not to take up that option.
Well, I mean, obviously, the Brexit discussions rolled on and on for a long time. Lots of people have got lots of strong opinions in both directions. Look, there are problems with some businesses right now. I think, really, for me, the main problem which I'm worried about is what is going to happen when everybody comes off furlough. Are all of these people, at the moment, that's one of the reasons why vacancies are high, because people are on furlough. When the furlough ends, are they going to find new work? And the other thing which I'm always looking at is what's happening with inequality, what's happening with house prices. My big concern is we're going to see, on top of that, potentially a big rise in inflation. So really, we're sort of on the edge of something happening here, and there's a lot of big risks which could be about to hit ordinary people, ordinary families. Yeah,
and inflation's an interesting one, because it's hovering around 4% just now, I think, isn't it? Which is twice the target rate of 2%. And is that being driven to an extent by wage demands? Because wage increases are part of the data that we're seeing as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Darren. If I could just talk a little bit about that, because it's a really interesting situation, right? So if you look at COVID, the government spent about £450 billion last year in COVID support for the economy. We all saw the furlough scheme. That was a big part of the cost, right? Now, normally, when the government spends a lot of money, they will tax people or they will borrow money. But in this instance, what the government did was they borrowed money, but they borrowed it from the Bank of England, which is part of the government. And the Bank of England itself printed the money. So essentially, that £450 billion, which was due to support the economy in COVID, was basically printed. So what happened was, in COVID, suddenly the government has discovered that the magic money tree exists after all, and they've been using it a lot. £450,000, that's £10,000 per adult in the country. And that money doesn't disappear. What that means is a lot of people in this country are sitting on a lot more money than they normally have been, right? And I came out at the beginning of COVID and said what this is going to cause. The number one thing you're going to see is, first of all, inflation, but mainly because we can look at the statistics now and see that money is being largely held by richer people, you're going to see massive increase in house prices and stock prices. My concern is, what is it going to do for inequality and what is it going to do for the ability of ordinary people from ordinary families to buy houses to raise their kids in?
And that inequality is already there, of course, isn't it? Because people who were able to get through the pandemic without losing their jobs, maybe working from home. My partner found himself in this very fortunate position as well, able to keep working, but with fewer things to spend money on. So inevitably, resources will stack up. You'll end up with more money at the end of this than you had going into the pandemic. But for people who weren't in that position, they were having to dig into whatever savings they had. They maybe lost their job once, twice. They were relying on furlough, which might not have made up the entirety of the money that they were losing. And so the inequality has widened already, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think you've really captured it there, Darren. Like, you know, COVID has been such a disaster for inequality from so many angles, right? People who tended to be higher earning generally kept their jobs. The people who lost their jobs were self-employed people and lower earning people, right? People who have very high incomes saved a huge amount of money because their spending decreased. But ordinary and poorer people, most of their outgoings are on essentials like rent and bills, so they didn't save any money. So what that means is, after already having seen inequality increasing so much in the last 10 years, now with COVID, that's really going into superdrive. And what we're seeing is massive amounts of money stacked up in the bank accounts of richer individuals. And, you know, we only have to look back to 2008 to find the crisis where, again, we tried to fix a crisis by printing money that ended up with richer people. And how did that turn out? Well, London house prices doubled and stock prices went up 500, 600%, whilst wages have done nothing in 15 years. So my real concern is if we don't do something about the inequality coming out of COVID now, that's going to happen again. And I really worry about what is that going to mean for ordinary families if London house prices double again, because I honestly think it could happen.
And not just London house prices, but London is not necessarily the most expensive place in the country now to buy property anyway. It might become so again, but there are places where you're paying potentially 10, 11, 12 times your salary.
Yeah, we're seeing, after 2008, the biggest rises were in London. But in the last couple of years, actually, it's other parts of the country that have been going up quicker. So we're seeing, we've had one epidemic of COVID, but in the last 15 years, there's been an epidemic of housing unaffordability in London, and we're going to see that spread throughout the rest of the country now. We're going to have a real problem. What do young people from ordinary hardworking families do when a house costs 10, 15 times your income? That's my real concern.
Let's just end on the good news story. If we zoom right out and if we park for a moment the disastrous slow puncture that is Brexit, if we can strip that out of the conversation for a moment, God, how I wish we could. But let's just look at the recovery from COVID. It appears, doesn't it, that the pandemic, at least in the UK, has not caused quite the disaster that was feared. This was not at the top end of people's expectations.
Yeah, look, we've got a long way to go with this for sure. There's problems down the line. There's a massive government debt. There's huge amounts of money in the economy. There's inequality. I talk a lot about that on my YouTube at Gary's Economics. But what has happened, and it's been amazing here, is what's happened in COVID is we've seen that if the government is willing to stand up and support workers through the difficult times, then really there isn't any need for people to lose their jobs. After 2008, millions and millions of people lost their jobs.
Yes.
But here in COVID, governments, not just the UK government, but governments all over the world have came out and said, no, we're going to support workers. We're going to make sure those jobs are still there when we come out of the crisis. And what we've seen is if governments are willing to support their economies and support the people in their countries, then we can come through a crisis without massive losses in workers. But there are still a lot of problems in the system and people need to be careful.
Gary, where can we find you online once again?
Gary's Economics on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, everything, Instagram.
You are ubiquitous.
Yes, indeed. Gary's Economics. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gary Stevenson, as you heard, joining me this morning reflecting on that but quite good economic news. Right, a couple of minutes away from 4.
Housing could be so much more affordable, wages could be so much higher, and we could have so many more options in how we live our lives. There is one other thing they can do with that massive amount of income. They can buy your mum's house.